you break the law, if you decide to do this, we're going to hold you responsible.
You are the only good thing in someone's worst day. That is a privilege for a police officer.
At the very least, you could honor the sacrifices of police officers and their families.
We have the ability to save the Republic. Welcome to the On the Blue Line podcast with Wayne Mulder, and I am your host. You guessed it, Wayne Mulder. Many of the topics discussed on here are from a law enforcement perspective, and because that is my vocation. However, this show is about helping you become the person you want to be on and off the job. So we have a variety of topics and a variety of guests. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at On the Blue Line Podcast. Check out our website at ontheblueline.com. And please email me. The old email address that I used to give does still work. However, if you just want to email me directly, it's wayne@ontheblueline.com. And yes, I read those emails. And we're going to start doing a feedback section as well. So I'd love to get your feedback, and I will definitely either respond to you, or it's something we may use in a future show when I go over that. And then podcast listeners, those of you who listen on streaming platforms, please, it's a big help on Spotify, Apple Podcast, if you'd click follow for me, and on Apple Podcast, if you'd be sure to like and rate the show. 5 stars, please. If you love us, then 5 stars. If you hate us, 5 stars would be great, if you would do that. So I'd greatly appreciate it. And then lastly, know that all the podcasts are available on video on YouTube and on Rumble. So, real quick, I want to introduce you to this week's guest. Let me start with, if you haven't gone back and listened to last week's podcast, the one where I kind of go over what's been going on for the last year, some of the medical challenges and so forth that I went through, I encourage you to do so, because then you're going to understand why we're launching things the way we are and why I'm doing things the way that I am. But one of those things is every guest that I have ever done an interview, their content will go out to you. I feel bad. I apologize. But right at the end there, when I ended up needing to go into surgery and so forth, there was 3 guests remaining who I had recorded great episodes with them, really good content, and it never came out to you. So I do apologize to those guests. So the next 3 weeks are actually going to be older content. Really, this format, a lot of the questions, the things we discuss, it's all evergreen. So these really could release at any time. In fact, if I didn't tell you, you wouldn't know that these had been recorded a long time ago. But I always like to be fully transparent with you, and I appreciate you guys following along on this journey. So this is great content. This week's guest is Lindsay Faas. She actually tells us an anecdotal story at the end of this podcast that you are not going to want to miss. In fact, after hearing that from her, I've actually used it and told people about the great work she's doing when I speak to some of the academy classes and so forth about this idea of resilience. What she gives as an illustration of resilience, I think, is probably one of the best ones that I personally have ever heard. So you are really going to enjoy that. She's based in British Columbia, Canada. Lindsay is a clinical counselor. She specializes in trauma therapy and is the owner and director of Thrive Life, which is a busy counseling practice, which of course there's links to all that in the show notes. She's got decades of experience working with trauma patients, and she's determined to make important resources more accessible to first responders, you, me, with the launch of Beating the Breaking Point, which is a weekly podcast behind the line that is available to everybody. So she's got the podcast Behind the Line. She's got Beating the Breaking Point, which is this project she has. Be sure to check both of those out. Everything is in the show notes. So without taking any more time, here's this week's guest, finally, Lindsay Faas. Well, Lindsay, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Wayne. It's such a delight to be here.
I am so glad we got to connect. Somebody that a mutual friend, I think, or acquaintance of some sort put us together, and I'm so glad they did, because you're doing some great things, and we're going to have a really good conversation.
Yeah, I always love meeting other people who are working with these populations and having similar kinds of conversations. It's so fun that we get to learn about how all of us are trying to just make a difference for people that are making a difference. So I appreciate the work that you're doing as well.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, it's been refreshing, not to go down a tangent already, because I was going to go down a different road, but you're so right. Just in the few years doing this since 2019, to see so many people that I either didn't know what they were already doing, or have
Yeah.
come online since then. It is just such a neat thing to see.
Totally. Yeah, agreed.
So let me start, as I always do, with what I call my get to know you questions. Some are very easy here. So we'll start with the simplest of all of them. Is it coffee or tea?
Coffee always. Tea's gross. It's just flavored water.
I love the way you think.
My husband is the tea guy, so we have this argument a lot.
Really? Okay.
Yes.
So for you, is it just like black coffee, or do you like a particular type of coffee? Or I see from the facial expression, those watching on YouTube, it's not black coffee. So what is your favorite kind?
Coffee. There's like a very specific French vanilla creamer that needs to go in it. Otherwise, it just tastes like dirt. Although I value the people who are brave enough to drink it black. And I am a bit of a snob, and I'll go for a Starbucks caramel macchiato any day of the week.
Okay. Well, it is a funny thing. I think people that like particular flavors of coffee, that's where Starbucks comes in.
Yeah.
I'm more of a dark coffee drinker myself. I do like it black, but I do like Starbucks dark roast coffee because it has more flavor.
Yeah, totally. Well, and I like Starbucks mostly because it's just consistently the same every time.
Yes. And that is huge when it comes to the perfect cup of coffee.
Yes.
So let me ask you, not so much store or so forth, but more that relaxing place. Where's your favorite place to have that drink?
Okay. So in my house, I have this little corner in my living room, and I have this bright, like really bright yellow armchair that I chose the yellow because it makes me just so happy. And I live near Vancouver. So we have a lot of rain and like gloomy days for really long stretches of time. So finding like small inputs of sunshiny joy is actually really important to my life. And our back wall looks out over this really nice ravine area out over trees. You can hear frogs. So I like to sip my coffee in my yellow chair with the window cracked open a little bit where you can hear the birds and the frogs. And that is my spot.
Oh, that's awesome. Now, Vancouver, is that gray, cloudy winters, kind of like the Midwest, or do you guys get a little bit of respite from that in your winters?
Think Seattle. Yeah, it's a lot like the Seattle weather. We're only like 3 hours north of Seattle. We're actually like a 20-minute drive to the border from our house. Similar kind of vibe. So just a lot of gloomy, rainy. And then we like the last couple of years have been hit with some pretty solid snowstorms, but that's new for our area. So we have like zero infrastructure to handle it. Yeah. Which is always really interesting when you're like stuck in your house because there are no snowplows.
Right. Well, you have that part of it. And then if you have a lot of those gray, gloomy days, you get that whole seasonal effect of this. Like that's a whole struggle that we went through in the Midwest.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I grew up in a different part of Canada that didn't have so much of the gloom. So even though it was like so cold in the winter, at least the sun was still shining. Yes. And for sure, moving out to the West Coast, the seasonal affective piece is way worse out here than it ever was back there.
Yeah, that's the way it is in the Midwest as well.
Yeah.
So do you have a best or worst travel story?
Ooh, I've got a pretty solid one. So my husband and I did a 5-week trip to Africa before we had kids. And we were doing the like Serengeti safari thing. And you camp when you're on a multi-day safari, and like not like the pretty fancy nice camps that people see in movies where it's like really nice and there's doors and things. They're like tents that we brought and they throw up. And they have bathrooms. Did you know there's plumbing in the Serengeti? There is plumbing in the Serengeti. So we had gone to the bathroom in the middle of the night.
Something new.
It's a new thing. I didn't know either. And so we had gone to the bathroom in the middle of the night, and we were walking back to the tent, and we were having this conversation about like a totally different thing. I kept hearing this weird noise in the night, and I was telling him about it. And I was like, did you hear this? Didn't matter. We get back in the tent, and we had just zipped it up. And right next to the tent, like right beside our heads, you hear this ruh sound. And it was the chuff of a lion that had stalked us back to our tent. We beat it by about 3 seconds. And in the morning we woke up and we went out to there's like a spot where all of the groups set up their dining area. And so there's this dining gazebo thing. And so we're telling our driver, we had this lion outside of our tent last night. He keeps saying, no, the lions, they're far away. That didn't happen. And then turns out there was a guy that was up all night in one of the cook shelters who watched the whole thing happen. And he goes, "Oh my God, you guys, you had a line outside of your tent last night. You barely missed it."
Oh my
We're like,
goodness.
"We know." Yeah, that's, I think, my craziest one. It was a real close call. And what was really crazy is you're so tired from like the heat and being watchful when you're in safari all day that we were so tired that that happened. And then we actually just fell asleep and didn't even think that hard about it, which was actually the weirdest part.
That says a lot about human exhaustion right there.
Right.
A lot of what we're going to talk about today. Yes.
I don't even know how you do that, but I don't think I could do it again. But for sure at the time, that was what happened.
That is incredible. That is probably one of the best answers I've gotten to that question.
I'm so glad.
Do you have a favorite or most meaningful nonfiction book?
Ooh, favorite or most meaningful? I mean, I probably could come up with a list of like 10. I think probably the one that has mattered the most to me in the last handful of years has been Brene Brown's Dare to Lead. I love her, and I love a lot of her work. Her work would probably be half of my list of top 10s. But that work specifically was really meaningful at a very specific time in my life. So I own a clinic here in Langley, which is just outside of Vancouver. And we're a practice that has grown quite a lot. And so I had picked up, the book came out the same year we opened. Oh, wow. And so I had got it for myself for Christmas 2 months before we opened our doors, and we're inviting in this team of people that I had never managed before, and I had no idea what I was doing. And it was such a lifesaver in setting up a culture that I love so much and cherish so much here. So that was a really foundational piece for me.
That's great. That is, yeah. And you know, it is funny how it seems like the right book finds you at the right time. I don't know how many times I could say that. So
totally.
The last of these questions, what is that place that brings you the most peace? What's your favorite spot to kind of stop, breathe, and enjoy life?
That's a solid, good question. So I have a couple of relatives that live on Vancouver Island. And we go over a number of times every year as a family, but I also make myself go there once a year by myself, and I call it a work retreat. And it's a lot of work, but it's also lovely. And they have a house that is on a lake, and it's just beautiful. And they're the kind of people who really love to take care of people and like host. And so when you go, like, they don't let you help to cook, and they don't let you do dishes. And they plan meals around things they know you love. They often will have my favorite coffee creamer in the fridge when I arrive, and my favorite wine like ready. And it's just like, it's like a holiday on speed. And even if we're only there for like 3 or 4 days, it just feels like the most calming, because I don't have to be all of the like wife and mom and grown-up things for a little bit, because they just do all of the grown-up-y things. And that is the most refreshing thing. It's kind of like an all-inclusive, but I didn't have to pay for it.
That is awesome. And like you said, it may be even a step better, because the things that you love that, you know, are specific to you are already accounted for. So,
yeah.
So from here, I would love to hear kind of your origin story. Maybe tell us a little bit about you, who is Lindsay, and you can start really wherever you want, kind of leading towards what you're doing now.
Totally. That's awesome. So my name is Lindsay, and I work here in Langley, BC, Canada. I am a clinical counselor. So that's the work that I do primarily. And within that work, largely what I specialize in is trauma therapy. And so I've spent a lot of years working in domestic violence. I've spent a lot of years working with really complex trauma. In my community, I am known for doing a lot of the more complex ends of the work. So the stuff that a lot of people get tripped up by and get stuck in, those are the clients that get sent my way, which is work I really love doing. It is none of what I totally expected that I would be doing. As a kid, I always loved doing things that were helpful. And I was always really determined and organized. And I thought that would lead me into some kind of helping something. But one of the things that I did in grad school was I had said to my colleagues at the time, I'm going to really like invest in learning everything I can about trauma because it's the stuff that grosses me out the most. Like I'm not great at like blood and guts and gore. I don't watch those movies. I get nauseous when I hear the stories. So I'm going to like hyper expose myself to it because if I can do the hardest thing, then everything else will feel easy. And so at the time I thought I'll end up doing something else that's easier, but I'm going to start there and then it'll make everything else easier. And then I kind of fell in love with it. So that's what I do. And I listen to all of the blood and guts and gross stories from all kinds of people about all kinds of parts of their lives. And I love that I get to just be like a witness and a journey alongside person to some of those stories with people. So that's what I do primarily. I also am a mom to 2 kids. My kids are 8 and 6. I am a wife to my musician, stay-at-home husband, who is amazing, and thankfully does all of the things I don't have time to do, because I also do a lot of things that I just go, that sounds fun, so let's try that. And so my work has become a podcast that I have and a course I created and a whole bunch of other things that I had no plans or intentions of doing, but I keep having these moments of, that made me really mad, so let's find a way to solve that problem, or that really irritates me, so let's see if we can fix it. And these things just keep like evolving out of that.
I love that. And it really shows, I think anytime you come into anything in life with kind of like a heart of wanting to help, you intuitively start finding the ways that you can. Like it's almost like the universe or whatever your belief system is kind of draws you into these opportunities. I love how you talk about coming into a career where you're talking about, the blood and guts, as you said, are the most traumatic things. I was very similar to that in that I really, that wasn't how I grew up, a very simple upbringing, very, and so even going through like the law enforcement academy, I had no idea what to expect, or even if I could handle like that, death and these kind of things, because I had been very fortunate to not be exposed to it. And yet you find sometimes that it's kind of a gift to be able to go into those moments and help people. Totally. Speaking, what drew you initially into wanting to help victims? Because when you first came out of this or into this career field, I guess better said, it was to help people in domestic situations, correct? What kind of drew you into that line of work?
So again, I really liked the things that felt hard and complicated. And I was lucky enough to be offered an internship at a nonprofit organization that works specifically with women who are fleeing domestic violence, as well as early childhood experiences of sexual abuse. And so that's where I started. And I moved from an internship there straight into a job offer there. And it was work I loved doing. So much, but nonprofits also super not sustainable financially. So private practice kind of emerged out of that. And so I continued to do a lot of the same kind of work, just in a different kind of a setting. And that grew because as you start having clients who have a good experience with touching the really hard, vulnerable stuff, they go and tell their people about that. And suddenly I was seeing a whole range of people. I also work with a couple of contracts. So like workers' compensation kinds of groups are different state to state and province to province, but our version of that I have a contract with. And through that, I started getting a lot of our RCMP officers and local police, as well as corrections and paramedics and all kinds of different groups that are coming and have WorkSafe claims because of work-related exposure to traumatic events and experiences. And that became increasingly demographics I was serving.
That's interesting. And that was actually where I was going to go next, is how that transfer happened. So you didn't have any like law enforcement in the family or close, that like this was completely organic to what you were, to the population you were serving? Yeah,
it was. I have no background. Like we have no military members in our family. There is nobody. My aunt owns a bridal store, right? Like that's like, we got nothing. And so I went from landscaper to cop, so I completely understand. Yeah, right. Like it's kind of an interesting way to get the start, because I have some clients who are like, well, how can you know what we go through? And to some extent I can't, but in some ways that's actually part of what I offer is when you are surrounded by people who know what you know, they're also tainted by what you know. And it's hard to see that there's like life outside of that. And so having people in your life that can go like, there's some parts of life that aren't gross all the time, right? Can be a really helpful reminder, because we can lose track of that when we're really, really stuck in the muck of what people and life look like when you do this kind of work.
Oh, that is well said, and something I highly resonate with, because a lot of times I credit coming to this career field later in life, having different experiences. It's not something I started at 20 years old, and I see a difference in mindset between those that started in their 20s and those that had other life experiences and then came into this career field.
Totally.
What were some of the things in broad strokes, obviously not specifically,
Yeah.
but what were some of the things in broad strokes that you were seeing as you started seeing the first responder population come to you? What were the things that you were noticing that were coming out of these conversations?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's some really common threads, and it's interesting because when I started more of my passion projects around this, like the podcast and the course and things like that we can talk about in a little bit, it came out of this place of like really common features that were showing up across first responder demographics. So I would have police officers come in and they would talk about these challenges they were having as if they were unique to police officers. And I would giggle because I'm like, I'm seeing 6 other people today and ain't none of them police officers. And I have like this Groundhog Day. I have had this conversation 6 other times. And it's fascinating because everyone feels really like alone and isolated in a lot of those challenges. And yet my experience of them as the listener to all of them is that you're not all that alone. For sure, I think there is a really common thread about training across a lot of first response and frontline work populations. Pieces about having been trained really well to answer other people's mental health crises and crisis situations, but not necessarily being trained particularly well in what to look for inside of ourselves as our own indicators of not doing okay. And not knowing what to do if I identify that I'm not doing okay. I think a lot of organizational kinds of stress and trauma is happening. We've got some really broken systems that really don't serve the people that are serving very well. And so I know I had a client who shared, there's this poster at our station, and it's almost like one of those, like, you make sure, right? So it's like a person and they're pointing and they're like, it's you. And it said something to the effect of like, make sure you're watching for PTSD. And then, they're in my office and they're there on a WorkSafe claim. And we're talking about how what you have is PTSD. And they're like, I've passed that poster every day. And what's fascinating is every day I was confronted with the question of, well, do I have PTSD? And what's fascinating is no one ever told me what I should be looking for to tell me that I have PTSD. Yeah. Probably I could have caught this way sooner, but didn't until it was so far down the rabbit hole. And now here we are all this ways later where I'm in therapy having to like pull myself back out of this because no one trained me in what to look for. So yeah, you put it on me to look for it, but how do I know what that looks like to look for? How do I know what the indicators are? How do I know when I'm supposed to be doing something about that or waiting it out longer and hoping that it just goes away, right? And so there's a lot of pieces I think that systems can be doing better in supporting people in understanding what they need to be looking for in themselves, as well as when different kinds of supports might be useful to them within that spectrum of time. And then I think that there's just a lot of other like really interesting pieces, like since COVID, staffing has been such a tricky piece across most first response workplaces, at least here in Canada, I'm aware of. And the degree of added burnout that then creates for the people that are left behind has been a huge feature.
Yeah.
So, like it's no one thing. And what's actually been really fascinating for me across all of the first responders I've ever worked with is I have yet to have any who come in and say it's because of this one event that happened, right? I'm struggling because of that one call. It's almost never the calls. Like the calls are a part of it. And there can be, pieces of the calls that are like the straw that broke the camel's back. But it's actually almost never the calls that are really the problem. Because to some extent, the calls are the stuff that you kind of signed up for. Like I knew when I was going to be a police officer that it was going to mean that I would like maybe have to pull my gun someday, and that maybe I was going to be in a situation where someone else pulls a gun on me, and that I would see gross things and I'd have to interact with death. And I wasn't sure how I would do with that, but I knew that that was what I was signing on for. I didn't necessarily know that I was signing on for doing all the right things and then having my employer book me off on leave because I'm being investigated for how I handled that situation. I didn't know I was signing up for coworkers selling each other out. I didn't know I was signing, right? Like I didn't know I was signing up for all these other things that are peripheral to the actual job description that end up actually being the stuff that tends to like gradually degrade and lead us into more vulnerable places for things like operational stress injuries and organizational level trauma and all of these other features. And that's where I think we get it mixed up. I think a lot of people think it's the call. It's not the call.
That is so good. I could literally go 4 different directions here and have hour-long conversations with you. That is really, really good. And yeah, we're seeing the same staffing issues down here in the States, and it's compounded not only by the mental health, the what happened during the pandemic, and then also just the overall issues that are going on down here in the States, that I'm sure the whole world has heard about. So that all being said, though, I think where I want to start is where you ended, which is on that whole, there's something where you talk about how neurological changes can happen from consistent high stress exposure. And I would love to know more about that, but where I wanted to go with it is exactly what you were touching on, because you are so right. It isn't the high stress events. Now, I've been in some that certainly affected me. That's even through this podcast where I started realizing, I needed to do some self-care, some self-work, because an incident that I often talk about was an incident that involved gunfire and so forth. And I didn't even realize that it had bothered me until 4th of July down here in the States. And I'm sitting there listening to fireworks. And then all of a sudden I'm grabbing my wife's hand and thinking, trying to, where's my firearm at? Because thinking there were, all of a sudden I was taken back to that moment. But that being said, that's not what presents the most stress. What presents the most stress is, like you were saying, those in-agency things, scheduling changes, like, for instance, I'll jump on my soapbox for a second. You have 2/3 of your agency working afternoons or evenings, and yet you always schedule training at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning because we don't want to inconvenience the training department. So you've got guys working till, so then the answer is, well, we're going to let them off at 1 a.m. so they can be at training at 7, while simultaneously telling them it's the lack of sleep that is the problem. So we create the very stressful environment. So stepping off my soapbox and handing the floor back to you, how does this cumulative stress affect us? And does it build up these neurological changes that you're referring to, or are those distinctively different?
Oh, yeah. So not distinctively different. So what you need to understand about your brain is that your brain is like a muscle, really more like a series of muscles. And I talk about this in a bunch of different episodes on my podcast. So if anyone wants to do a deeper dive than the handful of minutes we're going to do this, go check it out. But it's like a series of muscles. And what you really need to understand about your brain is that there is like a specific region that handles a lot of your stress, particularly higher stress and trauma. So it's a part of your brain that kind of goes on autopilot. As soon as it starts to input that there is something stressful or traumatic happening, it takes over. And it does that because in, evolutionary perspective, its job is to keep us safe and alive. So it needs to act quickly and divert resources to keep you as safe as it possibly can. Okay. What's super fascinating about your brain is when it starts to utilize a certain region, that region gets stronger, like a muscle, right? So if I always lifted weights with my right arm's going to get real strong. And then what's going to happen when I need to lift anything, it's going to be my right arm that goes to grab for it, just because it's naturally the stronger arm. I'm not even going to think about it all that hard. It's just going to do the reaching, right? So our brain works kind of similarly. When we're exposed to persistent stress, whether that's, exposure related to traumatic calls, or just like the the additional above and beyond stress of like uncertainty, not knowing what comes next, not knowing what to expect. And that happens a lot within these systems where employers are really unpredictable, workplaces are really unpredictable. That I could get a call at any second, regardless of what the call is, right? Like the fact that I could be on the toilet and I have to answer a call right this second and figure out how to make that happen, right? Like all of that like heightened level of I got to be ready is that part of your brain. So when that part of your brain is working that hard, it's actually not meant to do that. No one's brain was actually wired to do these kinds of jobs. When we're asking our brain to have that part on and alert so much of the time, we are giving it a lot of reps, right? And so it's the part of the brain that's working out harder. But what that means is that even in like really not stressful situations, it will be the arm that reaches to grab for stuff, even though it's totally not the best part of your brain to do that job. So it'll be the part of your brain that then goes home and, you know, like your kids are fighting. And instead of it being like your parenty part of the brain that's able to be like, hey guys, let's talk this out and figure this out together, it jumps into risk assessing and reactivity that is like above and beyond what this situation calls for. Right. And so it'll be this thing that starts to like generalize itself out and start inappropriately handling situations, despite the fact that it is not the most skilled part of your brain for any given situation.
That's fascinating. Is that something that can be relearned? Is that something
kind of? Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. So the really
but you
hard
started
part,
with kind of, which leaves me wondering.
Kind of, yes. So the really hard part is because this is the job that you do and because you do it in like 12-hour shifts or whatever that looks like where you're at, you are still going to give that reps, right? Like we're not stopping working out the right arm to start working out the left arm to catch it up. So there will always probably be some amount of disproportionate ways in which your stress center is going to be more highly developed. Okay. However, there are some really cool ways that we can counterbalance and actually train alternative parts of your brain so that they can kind of look at that stress center and be like, hey, bud, how about you take a break for a minute? I'm going to do the heavy lifting here. So what's super interesting about your brain is that when your stress center activates, because it's associated with all of those evolutionary things about keeping you safe, it gets primary focus. And so what that means is it will actually divert resources away from other parts of your brain, essentially turning them offline in order to further activate itself. And it's doing that so that it can make sure it's doing all of the things it possibly can to keep you as safe as it can.
Right.
The hard part is it's doing that in a lot of situations that have zero things to do with safety, right? So like when my kids are fighting, no one is unsafe right this minute. None of this is required, but my brain is doing it anyways because it's just really practiced at it. So what's fascinating about that is one of the regions it will start to turn off. And we actually see this in EEG studies where we trigger the crap out of people and then watch what happens in their brain, is that their front brain, which is the part of you that manages your like reasonable, rational, logical thinking, it actually turns almost off in order to divert resources back to your stress center. And so when we force those parts of the brain to turn back on, we can force the energy in your brain to redistribute and kind of reallocate resources. And the more we train your brain to do that, the more we are enhancing its ability to learn new pathways. So instead of being like, oh, we just jump to stress center and we just stay there and we handle it here, it goes, okay, we're going to jump to stress center, but then we've got this skill that helps us turn on our front brain again. And when that's on, we do better things. So we're going to do that more because we handle life better when those work together, right? So we're trying to train them to coordinate. And the thing about your front brain is your front brain likes really easy, straightforward activities that help reactivate it and turn it on. Yep. So your front brain is responsible for things like language, sequencing, decision-making, math, all kinds of tasks like that. So this is really fun to do with people. I actually do this with people in session when they're feeling really triggered by something. Some people will go into like panic attacks or like reliving an event if they're having like a really traumatic trigger. And you do this thing where you kind of go like, okay, I just need you to look around the room and find me 5 things. Just identify them, right? Okay, there's the picture and there's the clock and there's the box of Kleenex and there's the stuffed bear behind me and right, whatever the things are.
Right.
Okay, cool. Now I just need you to like notice 5 things you can hear around us right now. Okay, well, I can hear the clock ticking and I can hear you breathing and I hear your laptop fan and I can hear the traffic outside and we have a train nearby. It's always going by, right? Okay, cool. Now I need you to name me 5 things you can feel. And I mean like tactile touch. Like what is your body feel? Well, I can feel like the hair on my face and I can feel my warm jacket and I can feel like my shoes feel kind of tight. I can feel like my bum in the chair, right? Feet on the floor. Great. Now I want us to do like 4 of each of those things. So 4 things you see, 4 things you hear, 4 things you can feel. 3 of each, 2 of each, 1 of each. The process of identifying the different things around us in the present moment and labeling them, giving them language, are actually, like stupid simple as it sounds, really hard work for the front brain. And so by forcing ourselves to engage in that task, we are demanding that our front brain turn back on, which means that it has to remove things away from our stress center in order to redistribute that energy. And then it can help us have a better perspective of what's going on around us. So I'll do this with clients and I'll say, okay, we're going to work through this activity. We'll kind of get ourselves where we've done the activity. I'll say, okay, now tell me about the thing that you were really upset about a minute ago. And their ability to talk about it is different because the part of the brain that is able to talk about it is different. It's not just their stress center and trauma that's like actively in it that's telling me the story. It's a part of their brain that can like look back on it as if it's past, that can recognize that it's old, that like maybe this happened years and years ago, sometimes decades ago. It's a part of their brain that can tell different parts of the story. Oh, but like then I remember that other thing happened that was actually really good. Our stress center can't remember those parts. It only remembers the awful parts, right? And so when we can get our front brain to get more online, we can give ourselves this gift of having our stress center kind of contained differently.
Now, bringing that is absolutely fascinating and probably one of the best ways I've ever heard that described. Taking that one step further, then, could agencies, could supervisors, could whomever within the law enforcement side of first responders, and really the other side too, but this is obviously what I can speak intelligently to. But say we're doing training that we're trying to teach them active shooter training or some sort of crisis response, high elevated levels of stress that are going on. By adding these cognitive steps that you're referring to using the front brain, would that then better prepare them for decision making in those moments? Is that kind of what you're saying here?
Potentially true. I also think the like aftermath of one of the fascinating things about our stress center is when it encodes memory, it does a really shitty job of it. Sorry, I should have asked at the start if I'm allowed to swear.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay. Sorry about that.
It's a podcast, so feel free to speak freely.
This is how I talk, so I forget. But I often do on my podcast. So the reality is like when your normal brain encodes memory, it encodes it totally differently than how your stress center encodes memory. And so when our stress center encodes memory, our stress center is actually one of the few parts of our brain that doesn't have a clock. So it doesn't understand the difference between past, present, and future. Because again, from an evolutionary standpoint, its only job is to keep me safe right now. So it acts as if everything happening is a right now problem, which means that when it's the only part of the brain on, it's the part of the brain that's also storing that memory. And then that memory is held in a space that doesn't understand that this thing happened a long time ago. Right. So when we get triggered, right, like your fireworks story, I'm like looking for the active shooter and I'm like looking for my gun because I feel like I'm back there again. Right. Like it doesn't feel like I'm in a moment where something is triggered. I feel like I'm in it and I relive it as if it is occurring in the present. That will happen for people about material that happened decades ago, which feels crazy, but is totally true because that's how your brain has stored it. And it lacks access to knowing the difference in time when you're in that part of your brain. So it's not just the like in the moment. I mean, it could, I would be curious about the research that might offer, additional information about whether that would really settle and offer more capacity in the thick of those moments. For sure, I can speak to the fact that following those moments, when we are experiencing and re-experiencing them, the ability to turn our brain kind of like not back on, but like to redistribute that energy in our brain makes a huge difference in how we continue to tell the story to ourselves.
Interesting. So then in that case, that's where these like critical incident stress debriefings and those kinds of things become so important. Is that the logic there?
They can be really important. I mean, that's, I think, one of my like mixed bag things. If I had to be on a soapbox right now, that'd be one of them.
Please.
Because I don't know that everyone is as skilled at offering those critical incident stress debriefs as I wish they were. I think sometimes they're offered in like peer support kinds of ways, which is like not to speak ill of it. I think it still has value. But I think if we're not offering constructive tools, then what it ends up being is, this thing where we're collectively reliving it, but no one's actually turning any new parts of their brain on. And so we're just re-entrenching a version of the story that activates our stress center and says, yeah, you should do the heavy lifting here. And we're just doing that in a room all together. So I think that there are some really great people who do that work, who are able to offer some really key tools that support the room. The other thing I think that I find with some critical incident stress debriefs, and this is actually less about the debrief or the person offering it and more to the workplace within which and the cultural pieces attached to that workplace, is that I think there's often a lack of sufficient safety, like emotional safety, to feel fully able to share and learn in some of those spaces. And so when there has been a lot of like workplace stuff, it makes it complicated to feel like you get to really take advantage of that as fully as you'd maybe like to.
I like that. Well, and I think at least this is my anecdotal opinion for whatever it's worth, but what I'm seeing is it's great. And that's where I'm, like you, hesitant to ever speak ill of at least they're doing something kind of mentality, And so we're seeing this, but then there is a question of best practices. And there is a question of, are the people that are doing these things the right people? Are they properly trained? Are we? So I think you bring up a very good point that even myself, that I've questioned from time to time. And I've seen it even in my own personal experiences, because not only is there the training portion of it, then whenever you get into conversations about like peer support or CISM kind of thinking, then you also run into potential personality conflicts. And sometimes if the agency or whatever is forcing these conversations to take place and the person and you already have some sort of adversarial relationship that's going to happen because of personalities, it can lead to all sorts of problems.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that, like, again, I never want to speak ill of efforts to make things better.
Right.
So like, I am glad that we are doing things.
Yep.
Let's throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. Like, do it. But I do think it's important that we be conscientious of the fact that just because a workplace has said like, oh, but we offered a critical incident stress debriefing, check, doesn't mean that that was effective, right? And so can we like check in with our people and go, hey, but we're still having retention issues and we're still having staffing issues and we're still having, so what does that tell us about how the critical incident stress debrief is of value, but maybe not like the whole shebang. And maybe it needs to be offered differently, or maybe it needs to be offered in addition to some other things. And maybe we need to consider a more holistic picture here.
Yeah, well, and I think you hit the nail on the head with what you just said. This is the whole problem a lot of times with government-based organizations, is it becomes a checklist. So like you said, it's like, so they're like, oh yeah, this is the newest thing. We need to do this. Okay, put it on the checklist. Let's hand it around. Well, that doesn't mean it did any good. You just, everyone's just checking it off. So I think that's a phenomenal point that you're bringing forward.
Yeah.
I'm going to come back to a couple of these questions, but I don't want to miss the most important stuff. And I want to say something. So you started a podcast at some point. So please tell us about your podcast.
Yeah. So I started a podcast, I think also in 2019. We might have started around the same time. And it was out of before the podcast, I started a course, and they're actually kind of tied to each other. So I started the course about a year prior to the podcast. And it was out of absolute frustration that it started, because I literally had a day where I had 5 clients back to back. They were all first responders, different versions of first responders. There's paramedic and a corrections officer and RCMP member and whoever else, firefighter. So literally like the spectrum and gamut. And they were all new. So they were all first sessions. And I find that often in first session, I'm doing a lot of like education about pieces like your brain. This is how your brain works. This is why trauma is, because people will come in with like, why me? Can I not hack it? Like, is it something about me that's deficient, that's not able to do this work? I did it for so long and I did way worse things than this call, but somehow this is the one that got me. And so we'll have these conversations about like, it really wasn't that call. It was the additive feature of these calls over time, plus all of the other organizational level BS. And right, like it's more than that. And here's how your brain works. And here's what's happening and whatever. And it did feel like Groundhog Day. It felt like I gave the exact same spiel 5 times. And I remember having this moment by like session 4 where I was like, I don't even know why I'm in the room. Like I could play a recording and it would be as valuable and I could save you money. Like, why am I here? I could be in another session that actually needs me. I could just give you this. And I was so frustrated at like, by the time I get people, they are so far down the rabbit hole that the amount of time and effort and resource that goes into trying to bring them back from that place is a lot. And while I love doing that work, I don't think I should be doing it so often. I don't think that we should be setting people up into these jobs where we know that's what happens. We know that's the trajectory. Why are we not doing a better job of front loading this? Why are we not educating people on how their brains work? Why are we not giving people tools to more effectively manage their brains at depot, at, basic training, at, university, if they're nurses, right? Like, why are we not doing this? Why are we training people in how to respond to everyone else's emergency, but not their own? That's stupid. And I had a temper tantrum and I went home and I told my husband and I was like, I'm so frustrated because I feel like I spent my whole day doing this thing and it's like important and valuable, but it's stupid. And I'm so mad. And so I had my moment and my husband, knowing me as he does, looked at me and said, so what are you going to do about it? And how much is it going to cost me? And I was like, that's why I love you. Thank you for that. And the decision was, if no one else is going to train it, I'll figure out how to do it. So I created this course called Beating the Breaking Point, and that's where this all started. And the course was intended to be this like online safe space. One of the pieces of feedback I had from a paramedic when I mentioned the idea to her, she said, we actually had a recent training for our company. And it was awful because it was kind of this vibe, like it was this idea of like resilience training, but it was offered in person in a group setting. And the trainer really didn't get our culture and that most of us don't actually like each other that much. And so it doesn't feel safe to talk about some of the working examples because at the end of the day, these are people who have to believe I'm going to have their back. And if they don't think I'm okay, it's not going to be okay. So I don't feel open to sharing how I'm doing and what my mental health stuff is. And so when we were talking about it, I said, I think that kind of like makes the decision for me. We're going to offer this online. We're going to make it something people can do in their own time so that it feels personal and like they can confront the stuff they need to confront without feeling like there's eyes peering in, judging it or worrying about them for it and questioning whether they're sufficiently okay to cover my back as we go out into whatever the next call is. And so that was the start. And then as time wore on, I discovered really quickly that first responders are the most skeptical humans on earth.
Yes.
Which I love about all of you, but it's also really hard to then convince them to try something like a course. And so I was suggested by a close friend to consider a blog or a podcast or something. And I talked to a number of friends. Most of my friends are nurses. I don't know why or how that happened, but it did. And so they all talked about, we have really long commutes and shift changes at 7. And so if you put up a podcast that we knew came out every whatever day at 7 a.m., I'd listen to that on my commute home. Perfect. And so that's how the podcast started, was this desire to like, how do we make this stuff more available? Like none of it is rocket science. Really, none of it is rocket science. Yeah. How do we make this available so that it isn't so disconnected and we're leaving people to not learn this stuff until so much later? I have so many clients who say, I wish I had known this 10 years ago. Maybe I wouldn't be here. I can't disagree.
Yep. Absolutely right. And I I strongly advocate for professionals, experts such as yourself, who are not tied to agencies for all the reasons you just said. Like the example you gave of the individual just not feeling safe in that environment. Not only is it the interpersonal side of that, but a lot of times the fear, which is well-founded, is that if I say something, it could affect my career. And
100%.
sadly, we have a history of that occurring. So we know that to be, it's not an irrational fear by any means.
Totally.
So what I love about the Behind the Line podcast, so anyone listening, you need to check out Lindsay's podcast, Behind the Line. What I love about it is, like you said, it's perfect for those listening to and from work, but it is actionable. It's small, digestible chunks of actionable advice from an expert. So that's what I love. Now, March was thematic, I believe. Is that going to be kind of what to expect going forward, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So the podcast has always been a bit thematic, and mostly because it just lets my brain think clearer. So it lets me kind of like chunk out pieces of work and go like, okay, we're going to tackle this. Some of the themes are themes that are tackled strictly as solo episodes where I'm just sharing my thoughts and tools. And others are thematic and based on interviews. And so it kind of mixes up week to week and month to month. It usually comes in month chunks. That will cover a theme for a stretch of a month. There are some themes that we'll pick up on and do for a longer stretch. I actually did a series the first season, on the Dare to Lead book, where I think that took 2 months to go through. We did a podcast series last summer that was interviews with diverse frontline helpers. And it was actually for that purpose of like, can we hear that actually there's a lot of us, and it's not just police or fire, or like we're not so unique in some of the challenges that we're experiencing, and can we bridge to each other a little bit as support resources? So we did that last summer for 2 or 3 months. And it was fantastic to hear some of the themes that are across everyone.
It's awesome. Yeah, definitely. To anyone listening, check it out. There'll be links in the show notes. It really is a really good podcast, and it has a specific purpose, which is what I love about it. It really helps. Even today, I was listening as I prep for this to another episode, and I was learning things. In fact, we won't talk about it because I want them to go listen to it. But when you were talking about the flight, freeze, and fight, fawn, and then an actionable step to do when you're in that moment. So definitely the listeners need to go back and listen to March's, all of them, but specifically to March's podcast. Let me go one last direction here as we're narrowing down time, because it's a word that's so often overused, but I do like the word. So let me get let me start with, what is your opinion and what is resiliency in your, I know.
Such a good question. No, I love that you asked it, because I actually did this, like, I think it was maybe a month or two ago. I had a bit of a rant on Instagram about this exact question, because I've had a number of people who talk about like, part of why I don't think your course has value is because it has the word resilience training in it. And resilience feels overused. And I think part of the mistake is the belief that resilience means to like bounce back. And that's actually not what resilience means. But it's been kind of this version of what we've been taught about resilience that I think is just super unfortunate. I feel very similarly about the term self-care. I think we've been trained to believe that self-care is like bubble baths. That's BS. Yes. Listen to my podcast. You'll get all of the reasons why. I have a lot of rants about that. Resilience is this piece about how we are able to tell a story. So a resilient capacity to tell a story is able to see all of the features of a story. So like the good and the bad. It's not just going like, oh, that was really hard, but it's fine, which is, I think, how we think about resilience, that we're supposed to just be like, oh yeah, it's another day. It's fine. I'm fine. Resilience is actually like owning that I am not fine, that I am not fine about this happening, that I am not fine about this existing in the world, but also being able to hold that intention with the fact that it does, and that it did happen, and that I have to find a way to like hold both simultaneously. And resilience gives us tools to try to hold those tensions. So it says, yeah, the world is hard and bad things happen, and the world is good and beautiful things happen. And there is a way that those coexist, and that you coexist in holding them. And resilience tools are the tools that let our brain do both things at the same time.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. And you're right, because when the word is often used, in fact, even myself, it usually is attributed more to like a rubber band or just something that returns to its original.
Totally.
But I love how you're describing, if I'm understanding it, is more of the ability to exist in both these moments at the same time. Is that?
Yeah,
okay?
Totally. Yeah. I can give you a really good example if you want a funny story.
Please.
Do we have like 5 minutes?
We do.
Okay. So my husband and I were on this trip to Portugal. We were on our baby moon. I was pregnant with my first child. And we're in this town called Porto, and Porto is a port city. There's this double-decker bridge, and it's traffic as well as pedestrian on both levels. And we had to cross this bridge. So the town is kind of split by this channel that opens out to the ocean. And we're staying on one side, but all the restaurants and wineries and things like that are on the other side. And so we're wandering over for dinner, and we're on the top level. And my husband is a musician as well as an amateur photographer. So he's got his tripod, and it's sunset. So we're standing on the top level, and he's taking pictures of sunset, and I'm, handing him equipment and looking out over the water and enjoying this moment. And he very passively says to me, I wonder how many people have, and then he kind of trailed off. And I very casually, with absolutely no thought about it whatsoever, said, jumped. And he looked at me like I had 5 heads. Like he was horrified. And I looked at him like, wait, what? Was that not the right answer? Is there another answer? I'm so confused, because in my head, there are no other answers. Right. And he says, oh my God, Lindsay, no, I was going to say proposed. And I was like, oh my God, there was another answer. Like, my actual words were, oh my gosh, you're so adorable that was an option. And he's like, you're twisted that wasn't
such a
the option. Right? Okay. Like it's funny because every first responder I've told this story to is like, there's no other answer. You were totally right. That's the only answer. And then I tell them the end of the story and they're like, oh, there's another answer. That's such a cute answer. I'm like, I know, he's blissfully ignorant and naive about life. It's fine. It's cute. The thing about it is this moment where I remember being confronted with this, like, oh, does that make me like twisty and bad and gross? That's how my view of the world is now, because this is the job I do. I deal with suicide all the time. These are all things in my life. They're not things in his life.
Right.
And I remember walking away from that and kind of processing that out a little bit to go like, can we hold the tension? My life includes this thing, and it includes it frequently. Like suicide check-ins are like a day-to-day, hour-to-hour part of my job. That is not a thing that registers in his life at all. Like he would never, not at all, not a thing, right? So can I hold the tension that like that is true, while simultaneously holding the tension that I am in this beautiful place, that I am with a person who sees the world so differently from me? And I actually had some clients who said, like, weren't you like mad that he didn't get it? And I remember saying, like, actually, I think that's part of my resilience is being able to go like, oh, I want to hold your version of this story closer. Like, I want to keep my humanity intact. And so while, yes, I'm going to hold that my understanding of the world includes this, I am also going to like receive with open arms that there is a version of life where that's not a thing you even register at all. Yeah. And that sounds beautiful. And I want to soak that in. Right. And that's, I think, what gives us resilience is the ability to go, yeah, this, but also this. And how do we like hold those together?
That is so beautifully put. That is a phenomenal picture of exactly what I've tried to say over and over again. Yeah. When I talk about the things that this career does and affects you, you're right. You go to places that is just not normal to somebody who's never been exposed to those things. Using the word normal, I don't like to do but in this illustration. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the way they see the world is wrong either. And I love that picture that you give us.
Yeah.
We could go on forever, but let me ask you my final question that I ask everybody.
Go for it.
Many of the things that we've discussed will answer this, but boiling it down, what is the one takeaway, the one thing that we as law enforcement officers can do that's going to make a difference in our personal lives?
Learn about your brain.
Okay.
Learn everything you can about how your brain works and then work to serve it better.
I love it. thank you so much. What is the best way for people to connect with you?
Yeah, so you can find me on Facebook and Instagram. It's at Lindsay A. Faas. And you can find me online, Google my name, and you'll find all the things. And check out the podcast.
Please. To all listeners, check it out. I'll have everything linked up, including to the, I'll just have everything linked up there. Go down to the show notes and just select it. You're going to love what Lindsay's doing, and it's making a huge difference. Lindsay, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me, Wayne. It was such a delight.
Thank you so much for watching or listening to this week's podcast. Every episode, it has full show notes with all the links and pictures, transcriptions, anything you may think you want. It's all at ontheblueline.com and then /show notes, and you can go to the individual shows. Be sure to check that down. Be sure to check all the links. It's in the section below. Other than that, that is all for today. Don't forget that I will see you next week at the podcast. But in the meantime, I'm going to see you out there on the Blue Line.